I remember the first time I heard about the Whitaker case. It was one of those stories that sticks in your mind, the kind you can't shake no matter how many other headlines or news segments you see. 42 years ago in the sleepy town of Maplewood, a young woman named Clara Whitaker disappeared without a trace. She was 19, full of life, and had dreams that stretched far beyond the limits of the small town she called home. Everyone in Maplewood knew her. She was the girl who always had a laugh that filled the room, who volunteered at the local library, and who everyone assumed would live a safe, ordinary life. But that summer of 1983, everything changed. One day she went out to meet a friend, and she never came back. From the very beginning, the case was baffling. The local police, despite their dedication, had very little to go on. There were no witnesses, no credible sightings, and no immediate suspects. The town held its collective breath as days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Clara's parents, Margaret and Henry Whitaker, were left in a state of perpetual anxiety and grief, constantly wondering if their daughter was still out there, somewhere alive and waiting for someone to find her. They organized search parties, distributed flyers, and even went on local radio to plead for information. But nothing seemed to break through the wall of silence that surrounded her disappearance. Over the decades, the case grew cold, relegated to a dusty file cabinet in the back of the Maplewood Police Department. Detectives came and went, each new team combing through the old evidence with fresh eyes, but ultimately hitting the same brick wall. It was a case that haunted the town, whispered about in grocery stores and around dinner tables, but no one had answers. People speculated endlessly. Some thought she had run away, others feared the worst, that someone she trusted had taken her life. But without concrete evidence, the theories remained just that, theories. I first got involved with the story years later, after becoming interested in cold cases that had remained unresolved for decades. There's something about these cases that draws you in, a mix of human tragedy, mystery, and the stubborn persistence of those who refuse to let them go unsolved. When I read through Clara's file for the first time, I was struck by the meticulous notes from the original investigation, witness statements, timelines, and the frustrating absence of any leads that could point to the truth. But even with the passage of time, there were fragments of hope hidden in those old files. A forgotten witness who had come forward but was never fully interviewed. A piece of evidence that had been misfiled. And most importantly, the unwavering determination of Clara's family, who never gave up searching for answers. The turning point, as it would eventually be revealed, began not in Maplewood, but in a neighboring county hundreds of miles away. A young detective named Lena Torres had been reviewing old cold cases for a new digital forensics initiative. The department had invested in a program designed to re-examine DNA evidence from decades-old cases, using technology that simply didn't exist back in the early 80s. Lena had a knack for seeing patterns others miss, for connecting dots that seemed entirely unrelated. When she stumbled across the Whitaker file, something about it immediately caught her attention. It wasn't just the age of the case or the lack of leads. It was the presence of a single, overlooked strand of evidence that had been tucked away in the corner of the evidence room for more than 40 years. The strand of hair, preserved in an evidence envelope, had never been properly tested. Back in 1983, DNA testing was in its infancy, and investigators simply didn't have the tools to analyze it in a meaningful way. But Lena's department now had access to advanced genetic sequencing, which could identify even the smallest fragment of biological material and match it against national databases. With painstaking care, Lena submitted the sample for testing, fully expecting that, like many cold case leads, it might not lead anywhere. But within weeks, a result came back. It was astonishing. The DNA matched a man who had been living a few towns over, someone who had no criminal record and who, on the surface, had lived a completely ordinary life. His name was Thomas Keene, a quiet man in his early 60s, known in his community for volunteering at the local food bank and coaching Little League baseball. No one could have guessed that beneath the facade of a perfectly normal life, Thomas had a dark secret hidden for more than 4 decades. The revelation was shocking not only to law enforcement, but to the Whitaker family, who had never imagined that someone they had passed on the street or seen at town events could be responsible for their daughter's disappearance. When the police approached Thomas for questioning, his initial reaction was one of disbelief. He claimed ignorance, confusion, and denial, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and as detectives pressed further, cracks began to appear in his story. Investigators uncovered inconsistencies in his timeline from the day Clara disappeared. and additional forensic evidence began to surface that tied him to the scene. It was a painstaking process built on years of overlooked clues, modern technology, and relentless detective work. Meanwhile, the Whitaker family was informed of the breakthrough. I can only imagine the mix of emotions they felt: relief, disbelief, anger, and a sorrow that must have been overwhelming. Margaret Whitaker told me later that she had spent 42 years imagining every possible scenario about what happened to her daughter, but nothing had prepared her for the truth finally emerging. The family had held on to hope all this time, and now, after more than 4 decades, they were finally going to get answers. What struck me most about this case was the way it highlighted the persistence of both law enforcement and ordinary people alike. Despite decades of silence, missed opportunities, and technological limitations, the truth eventually came to light. It was a testament to the fact that, no matter how much time passes, there are people who refuse to let cases like Clara Whitaker's fade into obscurity. And perhaps most importantly, it showed the power of modern forensic science, combined with careful, methodical detective work and an unyielding commitment to justice. As I delved deeper into the story, I realized that the Whitaker case was not just about solving a crime. It was about giving a family closure, bringing peace to a community, and proving that even after 42 years, no crime is truly beyond reach. It reminded me that every cold case file on a dusty shelf has a story to tell, a voice waiting to be heard, and a truth waiting to be uncovered. The small town of Maplewood, once shadowed by the mystery of Clara's disappearance, began to heal. Neighbors who had lived in fear and speculation for decades slowly found relief in knowing the identity of the person responsible. The story traveled through local news, social media, and eventually national outlets, capturing the attention of true crime enthusiasts across the country. And while the focus was rightly on the resolution of the case, the underlying narrative, the perseverance of a family, and the dedication of law enforcement resonated with anyone who has ever hoped for justice. Even after the arrest of Thomas Keene, the story was far from over. I remember sitting down with the Whitaker family one quiet afternoon in their modest living room. The air was heavy, charged with decades of unspoken grief and disbelief. Margaret Whitaker, Clara's mother, had tears in her eyes, but there was a strange mix of relief and exhaustion in her expression. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together, and Henry, her father, sat silently, his jaw tight, staring at a photo of Clara that he had carried with him every day since her disappearance. I asked Margaret what the past 42 years had been like, and she began to recount the moments that had defined her family's life. "You never stopped thinking about them," she said quietly. "Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary day, you think, is this a day I find out what happened to my daughter? You hope, and you pray, and you hold on to the possibility, but the silence is crushing." The way she described it, the absence wasn't just about Clara. It was about the life they had imagined and the milestones that would never come. The small things, like hearing her laugh or sharing a meal, had been stolen from them, replaced by a lingering uncertainty that never went away. What struck me most was how meticulous the family had been over the years in trying to preserve the possibility of closure. They had kept every scrap of information, every note, every news clipping, and every photograph that might one day help solve the case. Margaret pointed to a cabinet in the corner filled with binders labeled by year, and I realized that these were more than just files. They were a testament to a lifetime of hope, a tangible representation of the family's unwillingness to give up. It was heartbreaking and inspiring all at once. Meanwhile, Detective Lena Torres and her team were working tirelessly to build a case against Thomas Keene. The investigation had revealed a series of carefully concealed actions designed to avoid suspicion, but the deeper they dug, the more cracks appeared in his narrative. Old acquaintances came forward, sometimes reluctantly, confirming minor details that, when combined with the DNA evidence, formed a clearer picture of the night Clara disappeared. Each new piece of information added weight to the case, slowly unraveling the carefully constructed life that Thomas had maintained for more than 4 decades. I remember reviewing the evidence files with Lena one afternoon. She had a way of explaining the details without losing the human element. "It's not just about the DNA," she said, flipping through the worn pages of the case file. "It's about timelines, behavioral patterns, and the people who were brave enough to come forward after all these years. Every small detail matters." Her words resonated with me, especially as I thought about the painstaking dedication it had taken to reach this point. In a way, this case was as much about perseverance and attention to detail as it was about modern forensic technology. One of the most emotional moments came when the family was able to see the crime scene photographs and forensic reconstructions for the first time. It was handled with care, of course, but there was a profound impact in seeing tangible representations of the night Clara vanished. Margaret described the experience as a mix of shock and relief. It was awful, seeing it like that, she admitted. But at the same time, it made everything real. We finally understood, after so many years, that it wasn't our fault. We couldn't have done anything differently. It finally makes sense. As I listened to her, I couldn't help but think about the psychology of closure and its importance in cases like this. For decades, the unknown has the power to haunt families, to prevent healing, and to cast a shadow over every aspect of life. But once the truth is revealed, even if it is painful, there's a strange kind of relief. The uncertainty is replaced by clarity, the questions replaced by answers. And for the Whitakers, that clarity came at long last, bringing with it a bittersweet sense of justice and understanding. Detective Torres explained that one of the key breakthroughs in the case was revisiting old witness statements that had initially been dismissed or overlooked. People's memories fade, and sometimes they are afraid to come forward. But with the weight of modern evidence and the renewed investigation, witnesses felt empowered to speak honestly. Their statements, combined with advanced forensic techniques, allowed investigators to reconstruct a timeline of Clara's disappearance with a level of precision that had been impossible back in 1983. The town of Maplewood itself began to react in ways that I didn't expect. Once the news of the breakthrough became public, the community's grief transformed into a mixture of shock and relief. Neighbors who had speculated for decades about what might have happened to Clara now had confirmation, and for some it was a cathartic moment. The local newspaper ran a series of articles detailing the investigation, the arrest, and the painstaking work that went into solving a case that had seemed unsolvable. Community members shared their own memories of Clara, honoring her life and reflecting on the impact of her disappearance. What was remarkable was how the story bridged generations. Young people who had never known Clara learned about her through social media posts, local news stories, and word-of-mouth accounts. The narrative of a small-town girl, lost and then finally accounted for after 42 years, resonated widely. It reminded people that every life matters, and that persistence and compassion can overcome even the most challenging obstacles. During one of my conversations with Margaret, she shared a moment that stuck with me. She described the instant when the arrest was made, and she realized that the mystery that had defined so much of her life was finally coming to an end. It felt like someone had lifted a weight off my chest, she said. I've spent decades wondering, hoping, praying, and now I finally feel like we can breathe. It was a simple statement, but it carried the gravity of 42 years of unanswered questions, heartbreak, and quiet endurance. The final stages of the investigation focused on corroborating all available evidence and preparing for the legal process. Prosecutors reviewed the DNA, witness statements, and the reconstruction of the events surrounding Clara's disappearance. The goal was to ensure that justice could be served in a way that was thorough, fair, and definitive. For the Whitaker family, the legal proceedings were another step in the journey, a way to solidify the closure that had eluded them for more than 4 decades. Reflecting on the case as a whole, I was struck by how intertwined the human and technical elements of the investigation were. It wasn't just about forensic technology or DNA matches. It was about empathy, observation, and the persistence of both law enforcement and family members. The human element, willingness to never give up, the courage to revisit painful memories, and the careful attention to small details was just as important as the scientific breakthroughs that finally cracked the case. The story of Clara Whitaker reminds me that no matter how much time passes, justice can still prevail. The passage of 42 years did not erase the truth, it merely delayed it. And while the scars of loss remained, the revelation of the perpetrator's identity allowed the Whitaker family, the investigators, and the community at large to begin the process of healing. It is a story about resilience, determination, and the unrelenting pursuit of answers that must be told over and over again to remind us of the importance of never giving up on truth and justice. As the investigation progressed, I found myself drawn deeper into the emotional fabric of the Whitaker family. I wanted to understand not only the facts of the case, but the human impact, what it was like to live with uncertainty for 42 years. to endure each anniversary of a disappearance without resolution. Margaret described the holidays as especially difficult. "Every Christmas, I would set an extra place at the table," she told me, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know if she would ever come back, but I wanted to leave a space for hope, for possibility." Her husband Henry added quietly that those years were a balancing act between clinging to hope and accepting reality, an impossible tension that weighed on them day after day. One of the most revealing aspects of the renewed investigation was the level of cooperation that slowly emerged from the community. People who had previously remained silent began stepping forward once they realized that justice might finally be possible. I sat with Lena Torres one afternoon as she recounted interviews with neighbors who remembered fleeting glimpses of a stranger in town that summer of 1983. "It's fascinating," she said, "how memories that seem insignificant can become critical pieces of the puzzle decades later. It reminded me of how small details, often dismissed, can hold the key to solving even the most confounding mysteries." The forensic breakthroughs were staggering. When I first learned that DNA evidence from a single hair could finally identify Thomas Keene as a suspect, I was struck by the intersection of science and human determination. It was no longer enough to rely solely on witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. Modern technology allowed investigators to uncover a truth that had been obscured for decades. And yet, as impressive as the science was, Lena emphasized that it was the meticulous documentation and cross-referencing of old evidence that ultimately enabled the match. Without the care taken in the original investigation, this revelation may never have been possible. I remember reading through Thomas Keene's background while working on my narrative. He had maintained an outwardly unremarkable life, participating in local events, coaching children, and attending community gatherings. It was a chilling reminder that outward normalcy can sometimes conceal darker truths. What was even more unsettling was the sense that he had lived undetected for so long, hidden in plain sight, while the Whitaker family endured unimaginable uncertainty. I found myself reflecting on the psychology of someone who can compartmentalize their actions in this way, the ability to maintain a facade over decades, the careful manipulation of appearances, and the complete absence of accountability until confronted with irrefutable evidence. Throughout the case, I noticed a delicate interplay between hope and grief within the Whitaker family. Even as progress was made, there were moments of anxiety and disbelief. When the DNA match was confirmed, the family experienced a tumultuous mix of emotions. Margaret described it as a rush of relief that quickly gave way to shock and sorrow. The truth they had longed for was finally within reach, yet it also meant confronting a reality that was difficult to reconcile. It was one thing to imagine closure. It was another to face the tangible, undeniable evidence of what had transpired. Lena Torres spoke often about the challenges inherent in revisiting old cases. "There's always a risk that people will resist reopening old wounds," she explained. "Some witnesses are reluctant to relive events, and families sometimes fear that the past will overshadow their present. But in Clara's case, there was an unmistakable need for resolution. Each interview, each re-examined piece of evidence was a step toward answering the questions that had haunted Maplewood for generations, and the sense of purpose it brought to those involved, from investigators to family members, was palpable." One afternoon, I accompanied Lena to the local courthouse, where the legal process was beginning to take shape. As we walked through the hallways, she explained the meticulous nature of building a case against Thomas Keene. "It's about more than proving guilt," she said. "It's about constructing a narrative that will hold up under scrutiny and provide the family with justice that's both thorough and credible." The dedication of the legal team, combined with the scientific breakthroughs and investigative persistence, created a unique synergy, a convergence of human commitment and technological advancement that ultimately led to truth. Meanwhile, the town of Maplewood itself had begun to heal, albeit slowly. Community members who had lived with suspicion and unanswered questions for decades started to find solace in the confirmation that the case was moving toward closure. Local newspapers published feature stories highlighting the perseverance of the Whitaker family and the diligence of law enforcement. Social media posts brought wider attention, drawing a national audience eager to witness the resolution of a mystery that had defied explanation for more than 40 years. And through it all, the memory of Clara remained central, her story a reminder of both loss and the enduring power of hope. I spent hours with Margaret, documenting her reflections on the impact of the investigation. She spoke about the little moments, the way memories of Clara permeated everyday life, and the ways in which hope had both sustained and tormented them over the years. "It's strange," she said. "For so long, I had given up on answers, but never on hope. And now that the truth is here, it's both comforting and heartbreaking. We finally know, but we also realize how much we've lost." Henry chimed in, noting the paradoxical nature of closure, that understanding the truth brings relief, yet underscores the absence of what could have been. The process of re-examining evidence was painstaking and methodical. Investigators pored over photographs, witness statements, and forensic reports from the early 1980s, cross-referencing each detail with modern findings. New interviews were conducted with former friends, neighbors, and colleagues of Thomas Keene, each providing fragments of insight that, when combined, painted a fuller picture of the events surrounding Clara's disappearance. It was in these small, interconnected threads that the story finally began to emerge, transforming speculation into certainty. One of the most striking aspects of the case was the emotional journey of the investigators themselves. Lena Torres spoke openly about the toll it took to revisit decades-old trauma. "You can't help but feel a connection to the families involved," she said. "It becomes personal in a way that transcends professional obligation. You're not just looking at evidence, you're looking at lives that have been irrevocably altered." Her dedication and that of her colleagues underscored the human element in forensic work, the combination of empathy, persistence, and meticulous attention to detail that ultimately allowed justice to prevail. As the investigation moved closer to its climax, the narrative of Clara Whitaker's life and disappearance began to crystallize. From the moment she vanished in the summer of 1983 to the painstaking breakthroughs of 2025, the story spanned decades, intertwining human resilience, scientific innovation, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. And while the revelation of Thomas Keene's identity brought closure, it also highlighted the enduring consequences of his actions, the years of grief, uncertainty, and disrupted lives that could never be undone. Reflecting on this, I realized that the Whitaker case was more than a story about crime. It was a story about humanity. It was about the lengths to which people will go to uncover the truth, the power of hope to sustain through unimaginable hardship, and the transformative impact of perseverance in the face of adversity. In many ways, it was a story that demanded to be told, not only to honor Clara's memory, but to remind us all that even the longest shadows of uncertainty can eventually be illuminated by determination and courage. By the time the investigation reached its final stages, the weight of 42 years seemed almost tangible. I remember walking into the Whitaker home, feeling the palpable tension in the air, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, her hand wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, while Henry moved quietly between the living room and hallway, occasionally glancing at framed photographs of Clara. The house itself seemed to hold the memories of decades, echoes of laughter, sorrow, and unanswered questions. I couldn't help but feel the gravity of the moment, the culmination of decades of uncertainty, decades of hope, and decades of relentless searching. Detective Lena Torres had arranged for a final review of all evidence with the team before submitting the case for prosecution. They had meticulously cataloged every detail, from the DNA evidence that identified Thomas Keene to the new witness testimonies that had surfaced in recent months. Lena emphasized that although the evidence was strong, the team wanted to ensure that there was no room for error. "This is 42 years in the making," she said. "One small oversight could compromise everything. We owe it to Clara and her family to get this right." Her dedication was unwavering, a testament to the human element in law enforcement that often goes unnoticed. One of the most compelling aspects of the renewed investigation was the way modern technology breathed new life in old evidence. I spent hours observing lab technicians working with samples that had been preserved for decades, marveling at how tiny fragments of DNA, once considered inconclusive, could now provide definitive answers. It was science in service of justice, a bridge between the past and the present that finally allowed the story of Clara Whitaker to be told in full. Lena explained that without these advancements, Thomas Keene might have continued to live undetected, and the Whitaker family would have been left with nothing but speculation and unanswered questions. During my time with the Whitakers, I came to understand the daily rhythm of their lives, shaped and constrained by Clara's absence. Even after decades, each event, birthdays, graduations, weddings of friends, and community gatherings carried the shadow of uncertainty. Margaret spoke of holidays as particularly poignant, moments when the absence of Clara was felt most acutely. "I would always set an extra place at the table," she said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know if she would ever come back, but it was a way of keeping her memory alive, a hope that one day we might have answers." Her words struck me deeply, a reminder of the human endurance that underpins these stories. As the prosecution prepared its case, investigators began revisiting the town itself, speaking with people who had lived there in the early 1980s. Some had memories that were vague, others recalled fleeting glimpses of Clara or of Thomas Keene, but taken together, the fragments formed a more coherent narrative. I accompanied Lena to a small neighborhood park where Thomas was known to walk his dog, a place that now seemed imbued with eerie significance. She explained how behavioral patterns and subtle details could provide context that helped corroborate other evidence, a reminder that even the smallest observations could be pivotal in resolving a case. The community of Maplewood began to respond in real time as news of the investigation's progress became public. Social media posts, local newspaper articles, and informal word-of-mouth updates spread quickly, bringing the story of Clara Whitaker to a broader audience. People who had once speculated quietly over fences and in grocery stores now share reflections and memories openly. The story resonated widely not only because of the shocking nature of the crime, but because of the extraordinary perseverance and patience it represented. 42 years is a long time to wait for answers, and the fact that those answers were finally emerging struck a chord with many who followed the case. One particularly powerful moment occurred when the Whitaker family was invited to view a reconstruction of the timeline. Using a combination of old photographs, witness accounts, and modern forensic analysis, the investigators were able to illustrate hour by hour the events surrounding Clara's disappearance. Margaret described it as surreal, a mixture of pain and clarity. She said, "It was like watching the truth unfold before my eyes, something I had imagined countless times over the years, but never with this certainty. It was shocking, but it finally made sense." I could see the sense of relief in her eyes, tempered by the sorrow of what had been lost along the way. Thomas Keene's demeanor during his questioning remained calculated at first, but cracks began to appear under the weight of evidence. I watched as investigators methodically presented their findings, each piece of evidence reinforcing the next. It was a painstaking process, one that required patience, strategy, and emotional resilience. Lena explained that building a case after such a long time is not only about factual accuracy, but also about maintaining the integrity of the narrative, ensuring that it's compelling, coherent, and airtight in court. Throughout this process, I couldn't help but reflect on the psychological toll on the investigators themselves. Revisiting old crimes, particularly those involving missing persons, carries its own emotional weight. Lena admitted that she sometimes found it difficult to separate her own feelings from the work at hand. "It's easy to become emotionally involved," she said. "You start to feel what the family has felt, and that can be both a strength and a challenge. Empathy drives us to pursue the truth, but it also makes the process heavier." Observing her, I realized how much dedication and emotional intelligence is required to solve cases of this magnitude. Meanwhile, the Whitakers began preparing themselves for the inevitable court proceedings. Even with the evidence in hand, they knew that the journey toward formal justice was not over. They met with prosecutors and legal advisors, discussing what to expect during testimony and hearings. Margaret and Henry approached this stage with cautious optimism, aware that while the identity of Clara's abductor had been confirmed, the path to legal resolution required patience and resilience. Their resolve was remarkable, a testament to the years of endurance that had brought them to this moment. As I documented the unfolding story, I began to appreciate the intricate balance of human determination, scientific innovation, and emotional endurance that defined the Whitaker case. It was more than a story about crime. It was a story about people refusing to surrender to despair, about investigators using every tool available to bring clarity and justice, and about a community slowly finding healing after decades of uncertainty. Every detail, every interview, and every discovery added depth and complexity to the narrative, creating a rich, immersive experience for anyone following along. The culmination of these efforts brought a sense of resolution that extended beyond the Whitaker family. Maplewood itself, once overshadowed by the lingering mystery of Clara's disappearance, began to feel the weight lift. Conversation shifted from speculation and fear to acknowledgement and remembrance. People spoke openly about the perseverance of the family, the diligence of law enforcement, and the remarkable power of modern forensic science. It was a community collectively reclaiming its sense of normalcy, finding closure not only in facts but in the recognition that justice had, at last, been served. The trial preparation was a whirlwind of emotions for the Whitaker family. I remember arriving at their home one morning to find Margaret and Henry surrounded by stacks of papers, legal documents, and photographs. Margaret's eyes were tired, yet resolute as she reviewed statements and timelines with a notebook in hand. Henry stood nearby, pacing slowly, occasionally stopping to glance at a photograph of Clara on the mantelpiece. It was a moment of quiet intensity, the kind that seemed to encapsulate the weight of 42 years compressed into a few short months. Lena Torres had been meticulous in briefing the family on what to expect. She walked them through courtroom procedures, explained the evidence that would be presented, and prepared them for the possibility of encountering Thomas Keene in person. "Remember," she said gently, "this is your moment to witness truth being acknowledged. Stay grounded, support each other, and let the facts speak for themselves." Her words carried both reassurance and gravity, a reminder that while the trial was a formal process, the emotional stakes were intensely personal. The day of the preliminary hearings was surreal. I accompanied the Whitakers to the courthouse, observing how they navigated the unfamiliar space. Margaret clutched a small talisman, a locket with Clara's picture inside, as she walked up the steps. Henry's hand rested firmly on her shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was tense, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and the quiet reverence of those aware that decades of unresolved questions were about to meet the scrutiny of law and order. Thomas Keene's appearance in court was unnerving. Despite the gravity of the situation, he maintained an almost unnervingly calm demeanor. His eyes flickered occasionally, betraying fleeting moments of unease, but his posture was deliberately controlled. Lena Torres explained to me that his composure was likely a product of years spent hiding his true self, the careful cultivation of an image designed to deflect suspicion. Observing him in that courtroom, I could see the stark contrast between the facade he had maintained for decades and the overwhelming weight of incontrovertible evidence now bearing down upon him. The prosecution meticulously laid out the case, beginning with the timeline of Clara's disappearance. Witness statements were read aloud, each voice contributing to a collective narrative that had been decades in the making. Photographs of the town, the locations where Clara was last seen, and the evidence collected over the years were presented with precision. It was a methodical process designed to leave no room for doubt, and yet the emotional resonance of the case was palpable. I watched as Margaret's hands trembled slightly, her eyes fixed on each photograph, each detail a reminder of what had been lost and what was finally being acknowledged. One of the most compelling moments came when the DNA evidence was presented. Lena Torres and her colleagues provided a clear explanation of how the analysis had conclusively linked Thomas Keene to the disappearance. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Margaret whispered a soft, almost inaudible prayer, and Henry's jaw tightened as he absorbed the confirmation of what they had long suspected but never fully known. It was a powerful reminder that science, combined with human determination, can pierce through decades of uncertainty and provide clarity where there was once only confusion. Throughout the proceedings, I was struck by the resilience of the Whitaker family. Despite the years of grief and anxiety, they remained composed, absorbing each detail, each testimony, and each piece of evidence with a mix of sorrow, relief, and determination. Margaret explained later that their strength came from a simple principle. They had spent 42 years holding on to hope, and now that hope had transformed into a pursuit of justice. They were no longer passive participants in a mystery. They were active witnesses to the culmination of decades of unanswered questions. The courtroom was electric the day the final testimonies were presented. I arrived early, as I had for every other session, but this morning felt different. There was a sense that the culmination of 42 years of unanswered questions was finally at hand. The air was thick with anticipation, a quiet tension that seemed to vibrate off the walls. Margaret and Henry sat side by side, hands intertwined, eyes fixed on the proceedings, their faces a mixture of anxiety and quiet determination. Every detail of the day mattered, and I could sense that even a single moment could carry immense emotional weight. As the prosecutor called the final witnesses, it became evident just how methodically the case had been built. Each person recounted their experiences, memories, and observations, painting a detailed and coherent picture of that fateful summer. There was a neighbor who remembered a fleeting glimpse of Clara walking toward the park, the friend who had noticed unusual behavior from Thomas Keene around the time of her disappearance, and a former co-worker who recalled inconsistencies in his stories. Each testimony, though small on its own, collectively formed a tapestry that revealed the truth that had been hidden for decades. I watched Margaret closely as she absorbed every word. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair, knuckles white, and her eyes flickered between moments of tears and intense focus. For 42 years she had carried the weight of uncertainty, of wondering whether her daughter was alive and whether justice would ever come. Now, with each piece of evidence, with each testimony, that weight began to shift, slowly but undeniably, from doubt toward clarity. It was a remarkable transformation to witness, the relief mingle with sorrow, the closure tempered by the memory of lost years. Thomas Keene sat quietly across the courtroom, his expression carefully controlled. At times, I could see the flicker of unease, a subtle twitch of the hand, or a slight hesitation in response to a line of questioning. Lena Torres and the prosecution team maintained their composure, presenting the case with precision, never allowing emotion to cloud the facts. Yet, even with the calm and professional delivery, there was an undeniable tension in the room, an electric energy that underscored the gravity of the moment. For the Whitaker family, the truth was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, undeniable, and close at hand. During the cross-examinations, the defense attempted to cast doubt on various aspects of the evidence. They questioned the reliability of long-term memory, the preservation of forensic samples over decades, and the interpretation of behavioral analyses. But each objection was met with clarity and meticulous explanation, reinforcing the credibility of the investigative process. Lena Torres, sitting beside the family, whispered occasional reassurances, reminding them to remain focused and to let the truth speak for itself. It was a delicate balancing act, navigating the procedural demands of the courtroom, while honoring the emotional journey of the family. I recall a particularly moving moment when a forensic specialist described how a single strand of hair, preserved for over 4 decades, had been key in unraveling the mystery. The technical details were complex, but the significance was clear. It demonstrated that persistence, attention to detail, and modern technology could overcome the limitations of time. Margaret's eyes glistened as she listened, whispering softly, "Clara, we finally know." The simplicity of her words carried the weight of an entire lifetime, a culmination of hope, fear, and unwavering faith in the pursuit of truth. The prosecution then presented a detailed reconstruction of Thomas Keene's movements on the day Clara disappeared. Using photographs, maps, and witness accounts, they recreated a timeline that accounted for every critical moment. Each piece fit seamlessly into the larger narrative, leaving little room for ambiguity. It was a remarkable demonstration of investigative diligence, and the courtroom responded with a mix of awe and gravity. Even for someone like me, who had spent countless hours documenting cold cases, the precision and care with which this timeline was constructed was striking. Margaret and Henry were allowed a private moment during a brief recess. I watched as they stepped outside, holding each other close. Margaret spoke softly, her voice trembling with emotion. 42 years. 42 years of not knowing. And now we can breathe. I don't know if anything would ever bring her back, but we finally have answers." Henry nodded, his hand resting gently on her back, a silent affirmation of shared grief and resilience. It was a profoundly human moment, a reminder that behind every case file and courtroom proceeding are people whose lives have been irrevocably shaped by the pursuit of truth. Returning to the courtroom, the atmosphere grew more intense as closing arguments began. The prosecution summarized decades of investigation, highlighting the convergence of evidence, witness testimony, and forensic breakthroughs that conclusively linked Thomas Keene to Clara's disappearance. They emphasized the unwavering dedication of both law enforcement and the Whitaker family, framing the narrative as not only a criminal case but a story of human endurance and the relentless pursuit of justice. The narrative was compelling, weaving together technical detail with emotional resonance, creating a story that was both precise and profoundly moving. Thomas Keene's defense attorney delivered his closing remarks, attempting to sow doubt by emphasizing the passage of time and potential errors in memory or evidence handling. Yet the strength of the case, coupled with the clarity of the prosecution's narrative, made it increasingly difficult to dispute the facts. Lena Torres remained composed beside the family, a quiet pillar of assurance. Her presence, alongside the meticulous presentation of evidence, underscored the convergence of human empathy and professional diligence that had brought the case to this moment. As the jury deliberated, the Whitaker family waited quietly. Margaret held a folded photograph of Clara, her eyes closed, whispering words of love and hope. Henry stood nearby, occasionally adjusting his tie, his gaze distant but attentive. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, a collective anticipation that mirrored the decades-long wait for justice. I observed the subtle interplay of emotion and patience, the quiet strength that had carried them through 42 years, now tested in the final moments before resolution. When the verdict was finally read, a mixture of relief and awe swept through the courtroom. Thomas Keene was found guilty, the culmination of meticulous investigation, technological innovation, and unwavering human determination. Margaret collapsed into Henry's arms, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in over 4 decades, the Whitaker family had an answer, a conclusion to a story that had defined their lives for generations. The emotional release was overwhelming, a testament to the profound impact of closure and the power of perseverance in the face of uncertainty. As I spoke with Margaret later, she reflected on the journey in ways that were both poignant and profound. "We've carried this weight for 42 years," she said, "and now, finally, it's lifted. It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives us peace. We know the truth, and for that, we're grateful." Henry added, "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding, clarity, and the ability to move forward. Today, we can begin to do that." Their words captured the essence of the case, a story not only of crime and investigation, but of enduring hope, resilience, and the human need for truth. After the verdict, the Whitaker family slowly began to navigate the long, delicate process of healing. The courtroom drama was over, the legal formalities concluded, but the emotional journey was far from finished. I spent time with Margaret and Henry in the weeks that followed, documenting how they adjusted to life after such an extraordinary revelation. Every conversation revealed new layers of emotion, relief, sorrow, gratitude, and even moments of disbelief that the truth had finally emerged after more than 40 years. Margaret described the days following the trial as surreal. "It's strange," she said, sitting in the living room surrounded by photographs of Clara, to go from waiting decades for answers to suddenly having them. The world doesn't feel like it moves slower anymore. It's just different. Everything feels sharper, clearer. And yet there's still an ache, a reminder of what we lost along the way." Henry nodded quietly, adding that the past 42 years had created a rhythm in their lives, a careful balance between hope and despair that now required adjustment. The absence of uncertainty was a strange, almost disorienting feeling. I accompanied them on a visit to the small cemetery where Clara's memory had always been honored. The family had placed a simple marker years ago, a tribute to their missing daughter. Now, with answers in hand, the visit felt both symbolic and profoundly emotional. Margaret knelt beside the marker, tracing her fingers over the engraved name. "Clara," she whispered, "we finally know. You're not forgotten, and justice has been done." Henry stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. It was a quiet moment, yet it carried the weight of decades of grief, hope, and relentless perseverance. The community of Maplewood also began to experience a shift. For decades, whispers and speculation had pervaded the town. Neighbors shared hushed conversations about the disappearance, the potential suspects, and the lingering uncertainty. But now, the narrative had changed. The story of Clara's abduction, the investigation, and the eventual resolution became a source of collective reflection and healing. I spoke with several longtime residents who described a sense of closure and acknowledgement that the long shadow of mystery was finally lifted. They spoke not just of relief, but of admiration for the Whitaker family's unwavering commitment to finding the truth. Even as the community processed the revelation, I observed the profound influence of technology and meticulous investigation in bringing the case to its conclusion. Lena Torres explained that every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every fragment of preserved forensic material had played a role. "It's a combination of human persistence and technological capability," she said. "Without the dedication of investigators, the courage of witnesses, and the scientific breakthroughs we now have at our disposal, cases like this might never be solved. Her words highlighted a central theme of the Whitaker story that justice, even decades later, is possible when dedication meets opportunity. The Whitaker family's emotional journey was mirrored by practical adjustments as well. They began attending therapy sessions to process the trauma of 42 years of uncertainty and loss. Margaret described these sessions as both painful and necessary. It's like peeling away layers of grief, she explained. Each session uncovers something new: fear, anger, sadness, but also relief and a deeper understanding of how we survived all these years. Henry added that therapy helped him articulate feelings he had long suppressed, providing a structured space to confront decades of unanswered questions. I also document the ways in which the story of Clara Whitaker began to resonate beyond Maplewood. Local news coverage evolved into national attention, drawing audiences captivated by the idea of a mystery finally solved after more than 4 decades. Social media discussions highlighted not only the crime itself, but the resilience of the family, the investigative breakthroughs, and the intersection of human emotion with technological advancement. People were inspired by the story, not simply by the criminal revelation, but by the demonstration of persistence, hope, and the capacity to endure immense uncertainty. One of the most poignant reflections came from Margaret as she sorted through a box of old letters and notes she had written to Clara over the years. Each letter captured fragments of memory, hope, and longing. Some expressed fear, others yearning, and some were simple updates about life in Maplewood. These letters were my way of keeping her memory alive, she explained. Even when I felt despair, I could write, I could imagine, I could hold on. They're more than words. They're a record of love, hope, and unwavering belief that one day the truth would come to light. Her words struck me as a profound reminder of how human emotion sustains us, even across decades of uncertainty. The investigative team, led by Lena Torres, continued to refine the narrative for public record, documenting every stage of the case with precision. The process was not simply about recording facts, but about capturing the broader context of human experience, the emotional and social impact of a disappearance, the complexities of a long-term investigation, and the resilience required to see it through to resolution. I was privileged to witness how both investigators and family members navigated these intersecting responsibilities, blending personal emotion with professional rigor. During a visit to the Whitaker home, Margaret reflected on the paradox of closure. We have answers now, and yet in some ways the absence of Clara still feels palpable, she said softly. It's a strange mixture, relief that we finally know the truth, sorrow for the years lost, and a kind of cautious optimism that we can begin to heal. We'll never stop remembering her, but we can move forward knowing the story is complete. Henry agreed, emphasizing that the journey of understanding and healing was ongoing, a reminder that resolution is rarely simple or linear, even when justice is served. The story of Clara Whitaker also sparked conversations about the nature of unresolved cases more broadly. Families and communities began reflecting on the challenges of uncertainty, the importance of perseverance, and the ways in which modern technology can intersect with traditional investigative methods to solve mysteries once considered impossible. In Maplewood and beyond, the case became a touchstone for understanding the human dimensions of crime, grief, and justice, a narrative that transcended the particulars of the case to offer insight and hope to others facing similar uncertainty. As I prepared to leave Maplewood after weeks of documentation, I realized the story had become something far larger than a single crime or investigation. It was a testament to human resilience, to the power of hope sustained over decades, and to the transformative potential of science when paired with dedication and empathy. For Margaret, Henry, and the broader community, the story of Clara Whitaker was no longer one of mystery, but of clarity, remembrance, and the enduring capacity of people to pursue truth against overwhelming odds. In the weeks after the verdict, Maplewood began to settle into a new rhythm. The town, once overshadowed by rumors and uncertainty, now carried a sense of cautious optimism. I walked through the familiar streets, observing neighbors exchanging greetings, sharing memories of Clara, and discussing the remarkable way the case had been resolved after 42 years. It was striking how a single story could ripple through an entire community, touching lives in ways both subtle and profound. People seemed more open, more willing to talk about the past, and yet there was also a sense of collective mourning, a recognition of the years lost to uncertainty. Margaret and Henry Whitaker embraced this period as a time to reconnect with the world around them. After decades of living in the shadow of loss, they began attending community events, visiting friends, and even volunteering in ways that had been too painful before. Margaret told me that she had started a small support group for families of missing persons, inspired by her own journey. If we can offer guidance, hope, or simply a listening ear, she said, then Clara's story can help others in ways we never imagined. The initiative brought together families who had experienced similar losses, creating a network of support grounded in empathy, shared experience, and the determination to pursue justice. The town of Maplewood itself also began to commemorate Clara in more formal ways. A small memorial was erected in the town square, featuring a plaque with her name, a brief account of her life, and an acknowledgement of the perseverance of her family and the dedication of law enforcement. During the unveiling, townspeople gathered, sharing stories, lighting candles, and reflecting on the passage of time. It was a poignant moment, a collective acknowledgement that while the pain of loss could never be erased, the truth had finally emerged, allowing the community to honor Clara's life and legacy. As I spent more time with the Whitaker family, I noticed subtle shifts in their daily lives. Margaret, once consumed by grief and uncertainty, now took moments for herself, engaging in hobbies and interests that had lain dormant for years. Henry began recording oral histories of the town, chronicling its history, its people, and the ways in which events like Clara's disappearance had shaped the community. Both spoke of a newfound sense of purpose, the ability to contribute to the world beyond their private grief, transforming tragedy into meaning. I also had the opportunity to interview Lena Torres one afternoon, reflecting on the broader implications of the case. Cold cases like Clara's are reminders that time doesn't erase responsibility, she said. It's never too late to seek justice, and it's never too late for families to find answers. The combination of human dedication and scientific advancement is powerful, but it's the persistence of people like the Whitakers that truly drives results. Her words resonated deeply with me, reinforcing a central theme of the story. Perseverance, hope, and empathy are as crucial as technology in uncovering the truth. The psychological impact of resolution on the Whitaker family was profound. Margaret described the shift in her emotional landscape as both liberating and unsettling. For so long, uncertainty defined us, she explained. Now that we have answers, we have to learn how to live without that tension, without the constant question mark hovering over our lives. It's a strange adjustment, but also a relief. We can finally breathe without the weight of the unknown pressing down. Henry agreed, adding that the experience had taught them the importance of patience, resilience, and the capacity of the human spirit to endure even the most protracted grief. One of the most unexpected aspects of the post-verdict period was the community's response to the Whitakers' advocacy. Margaret's support group grew steadily, drawing families from neighboring towns and even distant counties. They shared resources, strategies for navigating interactions with law enforcement, and coping mechanisms for the long-term psychological toll of uncertainty. The Whitakers had transformed their personal tragedy into a source of empowerment for others, creating a legacy of compassion and action that extended far beyond Maplewood. Meanwhile, Thomas Keene's sentencing loomed. The anticipation of justice being formally codified added another layer of complexity to the Whitakers' emotions. While they were relieved that the truth had been established, the formal sentencing process reminded them that accountability, even after decades, still required a legal conclusion. I attended the hearing, observing the meticulous nature of the proceedings. Statements from the family, along with psychological assessments and detailed accounts of the investigation, culminated in a sentence that reflected both the severity of the crime and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding its resolution. During this period, I also spent time reflecting on the nature of closure itself. In conversations with Margaret and Henry, it became clear that closure is not a single moment, but a gradual process. It involves coming to terms with the past, reconciling grief with relief, and finding a way to integrate the truth into everyday life. The Whitakers exemplified this process. Their resilience, adaptability, and willingness to engage with both their community and their own emotions provided a model for anyone navigating prolonged uncertainty and trauma. Maplewood itself seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Local schools incorporated Clara's story into discussions about civic responsibility, empathy, and perseverance. Community meetings reflected on the importance of vigilance, collaboration, and the value of preserving evidence and memories over time. Even local law enforcement used the case as a teaching tool, demonstrating how diligence, compassion, and modern technology can converge to solve cold cases that might otherwise remain unresolved. The story of Clara Whitaker also reached a broader audience through social media, podcasts, and national news features. People were captivated not only by the crime itself, but by the narrative of hope, persistence, and the eventual triumph of truth. Comments poured in from individuals who had endured their own uncertainties, lost relatives, unresolved disappearances, or cases that had gone cold, expressing gratitude and inspiration. The story became a symbol of possibility, proof that justice, no matter how delayed, can be achieved when determination meets opportunity. During one particularly reflective afternoon, I sat with Margaret in the garden, where she had planted flowers in memory of Clara. She explained how the act of tending to the garden had become a metaphor for healing. Each plant, each bloom, reminds me that life continues, that we nurture what remains, and that hope can flourish even after the darkest seasons. Her words struck me as deeply symbolic, a reminder that even after decades of grief, growth, renewal, and meaning are possible. As I left Maplewood that day, I reflected on the journey of the Whitaker family, the town, and the investigation itself. 42 years is an extraordinary span of time, long enough to alter lives, communities, and histories. Yet despite the passage of time, the truth had emerged, justice had been served, and a family had been granted a measure of peace. The story was not merely about a crime solved, but about the enduring power of hope, the necessity of perseverance, and the transformative potential of human determination in the face of profound uncertainty. In the months following the trial, life for the Whitaker family settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and remarkably new. The days no longer carried the heavy shadow of unanswered questions, yet the absence of Clara remained a tangible presence. Margaret and Henry began to embrace the quieter moments, finding solace in routines that had once been interrupted by grief and uncertainty. It was as if the world itself had shifted slightly, offering them a chance to navigate life without the constant tension of not knowing, while still honoring the memory of their daughter. One afternoon, I visited their home and found Margaret and Henry going through an old photo album. Each page told a story of a life interrupted, a childhood remembered, a presence that had been absent for decades yet never forgotten. Margaret carefully traced her fingers over a photograph of Clara holding a small puppy, laughing in the sunlight. She was full of life, Margaret said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. It's hard to reconcile that image with everything that happened, but at least we finally know what occurred. It's closure in a way we never imagined. Henry nodded in agreement, adding, we can remember her as she was, not as a mystery that haunted us. The town of Maplewood also continued its healing. Local schools incorporated lessons about Clara's story, emphasizing the importance of resilience, civic responsibility, and empathy. Teachers used the case as a way to discuss the value of truth, the importance of preserving evidence, and the impact that one life can have on an entire community. Residents spoke openly about how the resolution of the case had lifted a lingering sense of unease. It was as though the town collectively exhaled, embracing a newfound sense of safety, justice, and closure. Margaret and Henry also became more active in advocacy work, sharing their experiences with families in similar situations. Margaret's support group for families of missing persons expanded rapidly, attracting participants from across the region. They shared strategies for coping with uncertainty, guidance on working with law enforcement, and emotional support for those navigating the long, difficult journey toward answers. The Whitakers' personal tragedy had been transformed into a source of hope and empowerment, helping others endure what they had once thought insurmountable. In the evenings, the family began to incorporate new rituals to honor Clara's memory while also finding moments of peace. Margaret planted flowers in the garden that Clara had loved, and Henry maintained a journal chronicling reflections from the past decades. Together, they shared quiet evenings, sometimes reminiscing, sometimes sitting in silence, learning to coexist with the past without being consumed by it. The process was gradual, but each day brought incremental healing. Lena Torres and her investigative team remained a quiet presence in the town story, often consulted for advice on cold cases and methods for community engagement. Lena reflected on the enduring importance of persistence, empathy, and modern forensic technology. The Whitaker case demonstrates that even the most challenging investigations can be resolved with dedication, attention to detail, and the willingness to pursue every lead, she explained. Her words served as a reminder that the resolution of long-standing mysteries relies not only on science and procedure, but on human determination and compassion. During this time, I also observed the subtle ways in which the story of Clara Whitaker resonated beyond Maplewood. Social media posts, podcasts, and documentaries highlight the case as an example of hope and resilience. People who had faced their own prolonged uncertainties, whether due to missing loved ones, unresolved mysteries, or cold cases, expressed gratitude and inspiration. Clara's story had become a symbol not only of tragedy, but of endurance, persistence, and the transformative power of truth. One particularly moving moment occurred when Margaret shared a memory of a birthday celebration that had been marked by Clara's absence. She described the quiet rituals she had maintained, a cake set aside, a candle lit, a song sung in her memory. "Even though she wasn't there," Margaret said, "we acknowledge her presence in our hearts. It kept hope alive and reminded us that she mattered every single day." The sentiment captured the essence of the Whitakers' experience, the ability to sustain love, remembrance, and hope even amidst the harshest uncertainty. As the months passed, the Whitaker family began to envision a future that included both healing and advocacy. Margaret expressed a desire to write a book about their journey, detailing the emotional, social, and procedural aspects of navigating a cold case over decades. Henry contemplated creating a local historical archive, documenting Maplewood's evolution, the story of Clara, and the resilience of the community. Their plans were rooted in remembrance, education, and a commitment to ensuring that others could benefit from the lessons learned through their ordeal. The psychological impact of closure became increasingly evident. Margaret described moments of unexpected peace, waking without anxiety, recalling memories without immediate tears, and engaging in conversations without the looming specter of uncertainty. Henry noted that he was able to focus on personal projects and community involvement in ways that had been impossible for years. The resolution of the case did not erase the trauma, but it provided a framework for integrating grief, memory, and hope into a more sustainable emotional life. One evening, Margaret and I sat on the porch watching the sun set over Maplewood. She reflected on the long journey, the emotional highs and lows, and the eventual revelation of the truth. "We lived with a question mark for 42 years, she said. "And now that question mark is gone. It doesn't fill the gap, but it gives us clarity. We can honor her memory without being consumed by mystery." Her words resonated with a quiet wisdom, the kind that emerges only after enduring extraordinary adversity and arriving at understanding. The community, too, seemed to integrate the story of Clara Whitaker into its collective consciousness. Memorial events, public talks, and educational programs ensured that her story would not be forgotten. Maplewood embraced the narrative not as a tale of despair, but as one of perseverance, justice, and the power of sustained human effort. Residents reflected on their own lives, the importance of vigilance, and the ways in which community collaboration can achieve extraordinary outcomes, even decades later. As I concluded my visits, I reflected on the transformative power of the Whitaker story. Clara's disappearance, the decades of uncertainty, and the eventual resolution illustrated a profound truth. Hope, resilience, and determination can transcend time. The convergence of scientific innovation, meticulous investigation, and unwavering human spirit had brought clarity where there was once only confusion. The Whitaker's journey became a testament to the enduring capacity for healing, justice, and human connection in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm that, while different from the years before, carried a quiet sense of hope and renewal. Margaret and Henry Whitaker had embraced a slower, more reflective pace, savoring moments that had once been overshadowed by anxiety and unanswered questions. They often walked through Maplewood's parks, revisiting familiar paths, seeing the town anew with the clarity that truth affords. Each day was a mixture of remembrance, gratitude, and small joys, the simple pleasures of sunlight, laughter, and community that had been muted for decades. Margaret had become deeply involved in advocacy work. Her support group for families of missing persons continued to grow, attracting participants from all over the region. Through weekly meetings, workshops, and one-on-one sessions, she helped people navigate the emotional labyrinth of uncertainty, teaching strategies for coping with grief, engaging with law enforcement, and maintaining hope. Margaret often emphasized the power of patience and persistence, that even the longest waits can yield answers, and even the deepest sorrow can be channeled into meaningful action. Clara's story isn't just about loss, she would say. It's about resilience, love, and the enduring pursuit of truth. Henry, on the other hand, devoted himself to preserving the memory of Clara and the town's history. He meticulously recorded oral histories from neighbors, chronicled the evolution of Maplewood, and compiled a detailed archive of the investigation that had ultimately brought resolution. He spoke frequently of the importance of memory, not as a burden, but as a tool for understanding, reflection, and connection. The project became a source of personal fulfillment and community enrichment, providing a tangible record of lessons learned, challenges overcome, and the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to affect change over time. The town of Maplewood had transformed in subtle but significant ways. Residents who had once whispered about Clara's disappearance now spoke openly about the family's perseverance, the dedication of law enforcement, and the remarkable resolution of a decades-old mystery. Schools incorporated lessons from the case into curricula, using it as a teaching tool for civic responsibility, empathy, and resilience. Local media documented the Whitakers' advocacy work, highlighting their journey as an inspiration to others who faced uncertainty and loss. Maplewood had shifted from a place haunted by unanswered questions to a community defined by hope, action, and collective healing. I continued to spend time with the family, document their reflections and the ways they integrated the past into their present. Margaret often recounted the daily rituals she had maintained for decades, the letters she had written to Clara, the candles she had lit on birthdays, the flowers she had tended in the garden. These small acts, she explained, kept her presence alive in our hearts. They were a way of sustaining hope, even when the world seemed to have moved on without her. Henry added that these rituals had provided a structure for grief, a tangible method of processing emotions that might otherwise have felt overwhelming or inexpressible. The emotional aftermath of the investigation and trial was profound. The Whitakers spoke openly about the mixture of relief, sorrow, and ongoing reflection that defined their days. Margaret described moments of quiet gratitude, mornings when she awoke without immediate anxiety, afternoons when she could remember Clara without being consumed by grief, evenings when she could sit in the garden and feel a sense of peace. Henry emphasized the importance of integrating the past into the present, of acknowledging the pain while also embracing life as it unfolded. Closure doesn't erase loss, he said, but it allows us to live fully despite it. Lena Torres, who had been a constant presence throughout the final stages of the investigation, reflected on the broader significance of the case. The Whitaker story demonstrates the power of perseverance and collaboration, she said. It shows that justice, even after decades, is attainable when we combine empathy, diligence, and technological advancement. The family's resilience, the investigators' commitment, and the community's support created a synergy that ultimately allowed truth to prevail. Her words captured the essence of the case, that even the longest shadows of uncertainty can be illuminated when determination meets opportunity. One of the most remarkable aspects of the aftermath was the way the Whitaker story inspired others. Families who had faced missing persons cases reached out to Margaret for guidance and support, often sharing stories of long-term uncertainty, heartbreak, and the struggle to maintain hope. Margaret's counsel, rooted in lived experience, practical strategies, and unwavering empathy, became a beacon for those navigating similar challenges. The narrative had transformed from a private story of loss into a public testament to endurance, justice, and the transformative power of human connection. The community also began to commemorate Clara in meaningful ways. Memorial events, small ceremonies, and educational programs ensured that her story would not be forgotten. Residents reflected on the passage of time, the impact of unresolved cases, and the importance of maintaining vigilance, empathy, and engagement in the lives of those around them. Maplewood had become a living example of how a single narrative, the disappearance, investigation, and resolution of one young girl, could foster collective reflection, healing, and action. In private moments, the Whitakers continued to honor Clara's memory while also embracing the life they had rebuilt. Margaret maintained the garden she had created in Clara's honor, tending to each bloom with care and intention. Henry continued recording oral histories and compiling archives, ensuring that the story of Clara and the town would endure for future generations. They celebrated small milestones, birthdays, anniversaries, community events, with the quiet acknowledgement that while Clara was no longer present, her memory and influence remained woven into the fabric of their lives. I spent an afternoon with the family reviewing some of Margaret's letters to Clara, Written over the decades, the letters reflected an extraordinary journey of hope, sorrow, and resilience. Each note captured a moment in time, the emotions of a mother who had endured decades of uncertainty, the longing for connection, and the steadfast belief that truth would one day emerge. These letters were my way of keeping her alive in our hearts, Margaret explained. They remind me that even when hope feels fragile, it is never truly gone. Henry nodded, adding that the letters also served as a chronicle of emotional survival, a testament to the power of persistence and love. As the seasons changed, so too did the Whitakers' relationship with their past. They no longer lived under the constant shadow of unanswered questions, but instead carried the lessons and memories of their journey with dignity and strength. Margaret's advocacy work flourished. Henry's archival projects expanded, and Maplewood itself evolved into a community deeply aware of the fragility and resilience of life. The story of Clara Whitaker had become not just a tale of loss, but a story of triumph, a narrative that celebrated human endurance, the pursuit of truth, and the capacity to transform grief into purpose. Reflecting on my time with the Whitakers, I was struck by the profound humanity at the heart of the case. 42 years is a long span of time, long enough to shape identities, define communities, and alter the course of lives. Yet through it all, the Whitakers demonstrated remarkable resilience, holding on to hope in the face of relentless uncertainty, and channeling their grief into advocacy, remembrance, and action. Their journey was a testament to the enduring power of love, the necessity of perseverance, and the capacity of human beings to find meaning even amidst profound loss. The story also underscored the remarkable impact of scientific and investigative advancements. DNA technology, meticulous record-keeping, and the dedication of investigators like Lena Torres allowed for resolution in a case that had once seemed hopeless. Yet, even as technology played a critical role, it was the human element, the Whitakers' persistence, the community's cooperation, and the investigators' empathy that ultimately ensured justice. The case served as a reminder that while tools and methods are essential, it is human determination that often makes a difference between mystery and resolution. In the quiet evenings, Margaret and Henry often sat together reflecting on the journey. They spoke of the long years of uncertainty, the moments of despair, and the eventual revelation that brought both sorrow and relief. It's strange, Margaret said, to realize that closure doesn't erase the past, but it allows us to move forward with clarity. We honor Clara, we remember her, and we continue our lives knowing the truth. Henry added, we can finally live without the constant question mark over our heads. The journey shaped us, but it does not define us entirely. We can choose hope, remembrance, and action. As I prepared to leave Maplewood for the final time, I reflected on the broader significance of Clara Whitaker's story. It was a story that transcended the specifics of the crime, offering lessons in resilience, the enduring importance of truth, and the capacity for human beings to find meaning even in the face of profound uncertainty. The Whitakers' journey demonstrated that while grief and loss are inevitable parts of life, hope, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice can create pathways toward healing and purpose. In the end, the legacy of Clara Whitaker was one of both remembrance and transformation. Her story, though marked by tragedy, became a catalyst for education, advocacy, and community healing. The Whitakers had transformed their personal loss into a source of empowerment for countless others. The town of Maplewood had embraced reflection and renewal, and the broader audience that followed the case had witnessed a narrative that reaffirmed faith in human resilience and the possibility of justice, no matter how delayed. And so the story concluded not with a sense of finality, but with a recognition that life continues, memory endures, and hope persists. The Whitaker family, once defined by uncertainty and grief, emerged as symbols of perseverance and love. Maplewood, once overshadowed by mystery, now carried a narrative of resilience and communal healing. And Clara, remembered, honored, and central to the story of enduring hope, had left a legacy that would never fade.